Hey, what's up? It's Tati, and I'm back with another review. This time, Dark Side of the Ring, Season 2, Episode 5, Jimmy Snuka and the Death of Nancy Argentino. Everyone and their mama know who is Jimmy Superfly Snuka. He was one of the most popular superstars in WWF. Now, he had a girlfriend named Nancy Argentino who would often be on the road with him, and things were not great with their relationship. So they met because Nancy friend was engaged to another wrestler, and she would have backstage privilege, and she would also have Nancy tag along, and with her going backstage she would see Jimmy, and they soon started to have a relationship. Now, the beginning of the relationship, Nancy was taking Jimmy to see her family and spend time. However, whenever he'd go around them, he was super reserved and he would isolate himself. And not just isolate himself, like he got to the point where he wouldn't even talk to Nancy when he was around her family. And some people thought that perhaps that there might be a red flag with that, or maybe he was just really a quiet person. Although Nancy was on the road with Jimmy a lot, it was his manager, Buddy Rogers. Not only was he his on screen manager, but he also was his driver, his chaperone. He was always there to make sure that, things didn't get out of hand with Jimmy. And to be honest, he was not happy with that at all because Jimmy was doing all types of drugs, preferably cocaine, and his behavior would be so erratic that it made Buddy feel unsafe being around him. And he got to the point where he came up to Vince and said he is not driving him around anymore because he doesn't like dealing with him. So at this point, they needed someone that was going to be able to help Jimmy on the road. So what they did was they basically hired his girlfriend to be the one to drive him around and make sure he got to where he needs to go to on time. So now she's on the road with her boyfriend, but it's also her job to be there with him and take him around. Now, as their relationship got more and more serious, the family did see that there were some red flags and they were not comfortable with him being in a relationship with her. Now, one instance in particular, Nancy's sister, who was interviewed for the show, says she came home and Jimmy and Nancy were in the living room eating Chinese food, and she grabs a plate and she goes to go eat with them too. And she's talking and she's all excited and telling them whatever was going on with her day. He got so upset that he got up and went to put his hand on her throat to choke her. But he didn't get a chance to put his hand on her neck. She ends up backing away and she got so afraid and she ran upstairs to her room. Then Nancy followed her and apologized about what happened. And she told Nancy that, look, you need to leave him because if he's going to put his hands on me, I can't imagine what he would do to you. But she kept trying to make excuses for him. And while they're talking, Jimmy comes into the room and he says he's coming to apologize. And what he brings as a peace offering was a bag with cocaine. And he's handing it over to her thinking that she'll take it and accept his apology. And now that she's seen that he's also on this heavy shit, she wants her sister to stay as far away from him as possible. But unfortunately, that does not happen. Now, there's another really big red flag here that Nancy completely ignored, was the fact that he was married during this time. He was married and he had children. Now, Nancy's excuse was that he's separated from the kids and the wife. He's no longer having a relationship with her. And especially because he's on the road a lot with Nancy, she felt like she had nothing to worry about. But I do think perhaps she knew what was going on, and because she was spending more time with him, then she felt like, I guess, she was number one compared to his wife. Now, everyone knew he was married. His wife had no idea that they were separated at the time. And according to her, they were married, they had children, but he was on the road a lot doing his job. So he was able to live a double life. And I do think he led Nancy on to believe that possibly that he was separated from his wife. But I do think that at some point, Nancy probably would have known that it's not a double life thing he's living here. He's with both of them. So prior to Nancy's death, there was another instance that was publicly known where Jimmy was abusive to Nancy. Now, this was in January of 1983. They were in a hotel in New York where the guests were complaining about a possible domestic violence situation coming from one of the rooms. They did complain to the employees in the front desk to let them know what's going on, and they call the police. Now, before the police gets there, Nancy calls her sister, begging her for help and saying that Jimmy was chasing her, and she hung up the phone. And obviously, her sister is concerned, and she's trying to get back in contact with her, and unfortunately was not able to get back in contact with her until the next day. So now the police gets there, and the police actually sees him dragging her by the hair on the ground. They try to restrain him, but he is still holding on to her. Then he gets into a scuffle with the police officers, but him being so big and strong, like they were no match for him. So at that point, they had to bring in a canine into the room to help restrain Jimmy. And from there, they arrested him. Now, by the next day, Nancy calls her sister back and said, hey, I know I called you yesterday and saying that I needed help or whatever, but all that was just a misunderstanding. So now Jimmy, he gets arrested, and on the charges, he's getting arrested for assault. And what Nancy does is she goes over there and gives a statement saying that he never touched her, never was ever abusive with her in the past, and that everything was a misunderstanding. And she signed the paper denying anything that the police had thought was going on. So then they let him go. However, he does plead guilty for harassment. And what he does to make himself look good was pay $15,000 to a local charity and then act like nothing happened. And right after that, he's right back on the road as if nothing happened at all. So now fast forward to May 10th, 1983. They are in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where they are filming 3 weeks worth of wrestling shows. Now, in the morning, he leaves the hotel. He leaves Nancy in there. And later on in the afternoon, he comes back to the hotel room, presumably for a break. And then he goes back to the arena to film some more. Now, he comes back to the room probably around like 9, maybe a little bit later. He goes back to the room. And then around 11:30 is when the emergency responders received a phone call about an unconscious female. Now, when they get there, they do see Nancy laying in the bed, wrapped around with a bed cover. Now, they checked her eyes and they see that it was dilated. And the first responder was interviewed for the show, and she said when they see dilated eyes, it's consistent with a head injury. So Snuka told the police officer and the emergency responders that the night before they were playing around in the hotel room, playing wrestling, and she ended up hitting her head while they were playing, and that she complained about a headache earlier, but she was still conscious during the day, and he thought nothing of it. The last time he came back to the room is when he noticed that she had trouble breathing and decided to call for emergency help. Now, they end up taking her to the hospital and they're trying to save her life. However, Jimmy is in the waiting room and there are other people there. And he's opening his mouth and telling people all types of stories about what happened. But he keeps saying that it was an accident. Whatever happened to her was an accident, but he was telling people different stories. Now, unfortunately, she ends up passing away, and the hospital staff ends up calling her family's home and speaking to her mother and letting her know that she had passed away. So it was a staff member who had told her about her death, and then immediately Jimmy must have taken the phone away from that staff member and got on the phone and saying, hey, it was an accident. Nothing happened. That was my fault. And basically just letting them know that he was involved in some way, but it had nothing to do with any type of intentions that led to her death. And the mother was just so distraught that she ended up hanging the phone on Jimmy. And they were absolutely in shock about what happened. and they wanted to know more if Jimmy had anything to do with intentionally killing Nancy. So now it's the next morning, and the police are questioning Jimmy. This time he had a totally new story, which was the night before she had passed away, they were on the road to Allentown, and she stopped because she needed to use the restroom. Now she gets out to go use the restroom, and on her way back to the car, she ends up slipping and falling and hitting her head. And she gets back into the car, and from there she's conscious, but then the next day, obviously, she ends up passing away. Now, Don Morocco was actually in this room, and he has Vince McMahon on the phone. Vince McMahon gets on the phone with a lieutenant and assured him that Jimmy is going to cooperate with everything going on with this investigation. And then the police left, and Jimmy gets to walk away free. Now, Nancy has a traditional Italian funeral where it's 3 days. And on the second day, Jimmy comes to the funeral and he's wearing flip-flops. And Buddy Rogers is basically babysitting him at the service. And he goes over to Nancy's coffin and he's making a scene, and nobody wanted him to be there. Now, the mortician who worked on Nancy's body was also at the service as well, and he apologized to the family because he said he did the best he could do to make her look as great as possible. The family did say that she looked unrecognizable, and what hurt them the most was that she had bruising around her neck, and the mortician said he tried his best to cover it up with makeup, but unfortunately, it just wasn't enough, and it was so noticeable by everyone at the funeral. So by summertime, Jimmy was right back on TV, and he was becoming even more of a star. And that even led up to the legendary cage match that he had with Don Morocco for the Intercontinental title. And at this point, there couldn't be even more over. Now, Don, he says he feels so bad because during this time, he really thought that Jimmy was going to be probably in jail and having all types of trouble because of the investigation. But instead, during that time, his career took new heights, and it was like a blessing, but, a horrible thing at the same time. Now, even though Jimmy was getting even more over and more popular with the fans, there were still some people out there, like even after the show, that would shout out that he's a murderer and that he killed Nancy or whatnot. But for the most part, more people were cheering for him and saying positive things rather than bringing up what happened to Nancy. Now, meanwhile, the investigation was still going on, but there was no concrete evidence, which I find really hard to believe after the many years later, the autopsy does show what seems to be forced injury. So someone had to have hurt her to have, for her to have certain types of injury. And for whatever reason, it almost seems like things were just let go and swept under the rug. So now it got to the point where the detectives, they came over to Nancy's family house to let them know that they're ruling her death as a accident due to falling on the road. And her family was like, hell the fuck nah. Now, what ended up happening is right around that time, someone from WWF had contacted Nancy's family and offered them $25,000 to help them after Nancy's death. And they declined to take that money because that was not going to do anything for them. And they thought that it was weird that someone from WWF would be the one to offer this money to them. Now, fast forward, the family decides that they're going to file a wrongful death suit against Jimmy. They end up winning that suit with a default judgment for $500,000 because Jimmy ass did not show up to court. He didn't come to defend himself, to clear his name, nothing. He just didn't show up at all. Until this day, didn't get a dime of that money from Jimmy. And honestly, I think that was absolutely wrong. Even if he felt like he's not guilty for what he did, He lost that judgment, and he should have paid the family exactly what they deserved. And all that money is not going to bring Nancy back. So after that, his drug use just gotten much worse, and soon later the WWF let him go, and he continues to wrestle in in indie scenes and other smaller promotions until he retires. Now, fast forward about 30 years later in 2014, a journalist has contacted Nancy's family, basically letting them know that he's interested in doing an article about the 30-year anniversary of Nancy's death. And the family seems to be okay with that. Now, the editor of this article, he ends up going to the police, trying to get the autopsy, but they would not give it to him because they said that the case is technically still open. So then he decides to get his hands on the documents for the wrongful death suit, and lo and behold, the autopsy report is in the middle of all those papers. So he goes through all that. And it says specifically that the head injury was not consistent with a simple fall, but it was consistent with being struck with an object. And that she also had other injuries around her body and her face that suggest that there was a domestic violence situation going on. And all the way at the bottom of the autopsy, right before the doctor ends up signing their name, the doctor just suggests that the case should be investigated as a homicide unless proven otherwise. And it's very interesting because the police that was involved in that case was being interviewed for Dark Side of the Ring, and he said he had never seen that autopsy before, never knew not 1 ounce of information that was on that autopsy, and he said that the police did a thorough investigation and the case was concluded as an accident. So how did they possibly miss an autopsy? I have no idea. So later on, around this time that they're still, doing this article, Jimmy releases his autobiography. And this was the first time he publicly acknowledged Nancy's death. And he talked about how Nancy ruined his life. Rather than him admitting that he, did the wrong thing, was cheating on his wife and having an affair with someone else, he goes on to say that she ruined his life. Now, he mentioned something else in this story that was not consistent with what people had believed before. So aside from saying that Nancy ruined his life and that he never put a finger on her, he says something that's really interesting, that Vince McMahon went with him and had a meeting with the police. They had a meeting, and there's records of him being at the meeting with the police. However, unlike all the meetings that the police had with Jimmy, this was the only one where there were no transcripts, so no words were recorded between the police, Jimmy, and Vince McMahon. What he does mention here is that he told his wife not to worry because Vince McMahon had brought a briefcase to that room to take care of business. And from there was no other interviews about the death of Nancy after that meeting. Now, another thing that he says in the book that he never mentioned before is that the night that before she died, where she fell on the side of the road and hit her head, that the Tonga kid was in the car and that he witnessed this. Now, the producers of Dark Side of the Ring is telling the Tonga kid exactly what was in the book. And the Tonga kid said, no, that never happened. He was in the car, but Nancy never fell and hurt her head that night that they were going to Allentown. So then the producers told Jimmy's wife what he said. Jimmy's wife says, no, it's not that the Tonga kid is lying. It's just that he doesn't remember what happened. Basically trying to say he's a wrestler, and because of, them wrestling and having all types of head injuries, whatever, he doesn't remember what happened that night. Conveniently, he wouldn't remember so that your husband could be innocent. That's absolutely insane. I didn't buy it at all. I do believe that the Tonga kid was telling the truth when he said that none of that happened. I do think he probably really remembered if that would have happened. And this was the first time it seemed like he had ever heard those details at all. So fast forward to 2015, the case is put in front of a grand jury and they have to vote if Jimmy should be charged with murder. It was a unanimous yes. So then on September 1st, 2015, Jimmy was 72 years old with stomach cancer being charged with third-degree murder. Now, his defense in court was that he was suffering from severe brain damage and he also had cancer, which he could prove. Brain damage from obviously, taking headshots and possibly having CTE, and that he was not competent enough to stand trial. And guess what? The judge agreed, so there was no trial, no justice for Nancy. Now, 10 days later, after that ruling, Jimmy died. So I do think that is absolutely insane that there was no justice for her. And I really do think that it was poor investigating that was going on here, where he should have been charged with something when it came to her murder. Obviously, during the autopsy, it was evident that the doctor saw that there was some, domestic violence going on, that she was hurt and nothing was consistent with her falling on the street. And it's just insane how she also had other bruises in her body. And the police and everyone else that was involved in this case let all that shit slide and let him walk free. Now, the thing is that people would say that it's because he was a famous person or whatever that he was able to get away with this. Did Vince McMahon come in there with a briefcase with money and say, hey, I'm going to donate to your police force or whatever foolishness? I would not be surprised, because Vince McMahon has done things like this for top guys in his company to help them to get out of certain situations. So I feel like that's more than likely that happened. Now, I don't know for sure, but I do feel like Jimmy was implying that in his book, that perhaps with some money that helped him get out of that situation. And I really feel sad for Nancy's family, who never truly gets justice. But unfortunately, I think the police definitely dropped the ball on this investigation. She was only 23 when she passed away. And she had her whole life ahead of her. And I really wish that she had took advice from her family and friends when they told her to stay away from Jimmy. If she did, she would have definitely lived a much longer life. And Jimmy should have definitely had some repercussions when it came to what happened to Nancy. It's really unfortunate what happened. Guys, thanks so much for watching my video. I'll be back with another review, which is episode 6 of season 2. This is the assassination of Dino Bravo. Bye.